Our summary this year is going to be brought to us by Amy Bird, who is a freelance editor and tutor in Halifax. She has a BA from Briarcrest College and Seminary. She studied literature, history, and philosophy. She took Koine Greek in her earlier education, so she came to Halifax to study classical Greek in the classics department. She's been the editor of Dionysius, which is a journal of the classics department in Halifax. She's also been proofreading our conference reports. You've seen they're edited by Susan Harris, but just another ad, please have a look at those past conference reports and the one from last year's conference and pick some up if you think they would be helpful. She's also involved in digitally scanning and inventorying, if that's a word, the papers of Father Robert Crouse. She and her husband Matthew live in Trinity House behind St. George's Church with a professor, a chaplain, a teacher, a sexton, and Linus the Mouser. But they hope to add in the near future a butcher, a baker, and a candlestick maker. Amy.
And he's the incoming executive director of Halifax Humanities. Oh.
Hello. Hello. I see what Father Thorne meant about anxiety. Okay. So no one told me that Father O'Brien would give the conference summary in his sermon last evening, or that Zechariah would give it over 2 millennia ago. But I have promised a summary, and so I will do my best to follow in their footsteps. Entering this conference equipped with little more than the paper titles and my own imagination reminds me of a photo I saw recently of an astronaut, untethered, floating in the void of space. This being my first venture into space, I hope you'll pardon that I've approached this conference with the security of my own tether in the form of a quote from the German medieval mystic Mechthild. It is taken from a dialogue between Lady Love and the human soul, and I start with it as I started this conference, hoping it might provide a touch point between the yet-to-be-revealed secrets of the papers and me. So the soul, in great affliction, cries out, "Lady Love, you have brought me to such a pass that my body is racked by a strange weakness." And then Lady Love replies, "Mistress and Queen, in exchange, I have given you much sublime knowledge." This quote has resonated with me on a personal level, as over the past 5 years, I've experienced a gradual series of non-threatening, but pervasive and annoying health issues. Mechthild and this quote, in particular, found me this past year when I was no longer able to ignore my own weakness. I wanted to contemplate this personal affliction, but didn't quite know how to. And so I have been looking towards this conference in the hope that some sublime knowledge might become apparent as we contemplated both the weakness of the world and our own. So on Sunday evening, Bishop Edwards prepared us, not by providing any answers, but by pointing out how many questions lay before us. In doing so, he highlighted the essential link between providence and grace. He reminded us of how unbearable a contemplation of providence would be if not for grace. But more on this later. Let us first turn to thoughts on our most recent pandemic. Dr. O'Brien gave us a glimpse of how in Homer and Sophocles, plagues correspond with social and ethical disorder. Mary Lou Redden, in her response, suggested something similar has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Billionaires became richer. The underprivileged in overcrowded situations suffered. Communication and even memory broke down. Judith Moses pointed out this morning how in our own Canadian Anglican Church, we saw an inequality in how resources were distributed over the pandemic. Most of us in this room, I think, have felt the disorder of imposed separation and a devaluing of physical interaction. But perhaps, as in Lucretius, where the plague doesn't create the fear of death, but rather highlights it, our disorder isn't so much a result of the pandemic, but instead the pandemic has revealed the deficit that is already there. In The Madness of Crowds, the Louise Penny novel we read for this year's conference book club, Dr. Abigail Robinson, the morally compromised statistician, tells us that all who remain will be well only once we've eliminated those we deem unwell. But this is a lie. This life is mortal, and pain will find us all. Each of us will one day become sick, and we will not get well again. So what are we to do? Well, we can enter Father Curran's Age of the New Piety. Real life is unhappy, so let's plug in for a more desirable virtual life. Well, unfortunately, with his very next point, he reminded us that this option is to consent to the complete monetization of all our human activity, something that would, I think, actually inhibit our ability to be human. The interest in virtual reality seems to be driven in part by a desire to avoid pain and bad feeling. Perhaps this is another sign of the ever-present desire to return to Eden. However, it seems the best we can hope for in the online world is merely to learn to be more kind to each other. This alone would be a miracle, but it is paradise that we long for, and that is what we've lost. So although a turn back to the in-person life we know is comforting, it is still difficult to discern what exactly the Christian response to adversity is. Looking into the scriptures, Father Nicole complicated things by reminding us of the unknowability of providence. The Lord's ways are not our ways. He introduced us to St. Gregory, who did not help to make things clearer. Not all things we consider as adversity are evil, and not all things we consider as benefit are good. So, if I'm incapable of knowing the true nature of what is before me, then how can life have any meaning? Well, Dr. Robertson gave us the helpful distinction of the three lights found in Luther. The stark light of nature reveals the world in sharp-edged contrast, where little comfort is to be found. By its light, the doling out of adversity and prosperity doesn't follow a clear line of reasoning and seems devoid of meaning. The horrible happens, and there it is. But through the ultimate visitation, the incarnation, we receive the light of grace, by which we may start to see the cracks in reality where the light of glory shines through. There are no tidy answers here, but maybe there are moments of light. As we were reminded in last night's sermon, and as we read every day in morning prayer, the dayspring from on high hath visited us to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. So this act of seeing is also an act of participating. From Father Thorne's paper, all is grace, and once we know that grace, we call it faith. Through that faith, we gaze upon the cross and passion in a continual remembrance of our justification. Do this in remembrance of me. The light of glory shines through the cracks of the mundane. Bread is body, and wine is blood. Peter Bryson showed us much religious art and architecture which is dedicated to this gaze, a looking and a being looked at as we move eastwards through the church towards the Feast of Love. As we remember, we grow in deeper union with Christ. And through all of this, Christ transforms the meaning of our suffering in his suffering flesh. Like Felicitas, we can learn to say, there will be another inside me who will suffer for me, because I am going to suffer for him. So, Lady Love, you have brought me to such a pass that my body is racked by a strange weakness. Mistress and Queen, in exchange I have given you much sublime knowledge. It seems the sublime knowledge I've peeked at through the haze of my weakness has just taken me back to the beginning and the end. I was moved at last night's Eucharist by the return of the water of baptism at the entry of the church, which I haven't seen since the pandemic started. And I mean moved, both emotionally, but also physically, as the remembrance of my baptism drove me forward into the holiest of holies and into the remembrance of Christ's crucifixion where time meets eternity. And I returned, transformed. I'm back where I started before this conference, back where each Sunday is a question, but also an answer that it will take a life and a death to fully figure out. Thank you.